A small town in the Midwest of the United States, surrounded by endless fields and sparse forests, seemed like an ideal place for a quiet and measured life. Everything went according to schedule here. Morning services at the local church, Sunday dinners with families, evening walks along the central square, where residents greeted each other like old friends. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and life went on as usual. The church was the center of the town's spiritual life. Its pastor, Father Johnson, was a true icon of the community. A tall, fit man of about 45, he was known for his openness and willingness to listen to everyone. His soft voice, caring advice, and sincere devotion to service made him the most respected man in the area. People trusted him with their innermost thoughts. He baptized their children, performed marriage ceremonies, and helped them in difficult times. His impeccable reputation and charismatic influence made him virtually untouchable in the eyes of most. Among the churchgoers was 17-year-old Emily. A modest, good-natured girl, she grew up in this town, was always a diligent student and helper in church affairs. Her older sister went to college, and her father worked on a nearby farm, leaving most of the household chores to her mother and Emily herself. The girl was always drawn to spiritual life, and being raised in a religious family, she saw Father Johnson as her mentor and support during her difficult teenage years. Emily was a diligent parishioner and often attended church events, from charity dinners to Sunday school classes. However, behind the facade of religious piety, there was another side. Teenage doubts, anxieties, and emotional ups and downs began to haunt her more and more often. Emily felt lonely, unable to find support among her peers. She saw in Father Johnson someone she could confide in, and who would help her find answers to the questions that were tormenting her at that time. This was the beginning of her gradual rapprochement with the priest. Father Johnson, noticing Emily's emotional uncertainty, offered to talk to her after the service. He saw in her a young soul who needed guidance and direction. He said he wanted to help her deal with her inner conflicts and find answers through faith. Their first conversations, held within the walls of the church, seemed innocent and even helpful. Father Johnson inspired her to spread goodness and light, spoke of spiritual quests, of the importance of finding one's way in life. Emily, under his influence, began to stay after services more and more often for private conversations with Father Johnson. She shared her fears, doubts, and hopes. Father Johnson spoke to her about the importance of spiritual growth, about how religion can help her cope with difficulties. Emily took his words as truth, seeing in him not only a pastor, but also a wise mentor who could help her find herself in this difficult world. But each time their meetings became more personal. Something in Father Johnson's behavior began to seem unusual. There was something understated in his looks and words, subtle hints that their connection went beyond the usual spiritual relationship between a priest and a parishioner. Emily, being young and inexperienced, did not immediately realize that she had fallen into a trap of manipulation and dependency. She began to trust the priest more than anyone else, and could not understand that with each passing day she was falling deeper into a dangerous game whose rules were not hers to control. On the outside, to the rest of the community, Father Johnson remained as revered and respected as ever. No one suspected that behind the facade of piety and virtue lurked something dark, something that would soon lead to a tragedy that would change life in this small town forever. As Father Johnson began to pay special attention to Emily, their meetings gradually became more than just spiritual instruction. Their conversations, which had initially focused on faith and life, began to delve into personal and intimate matters. Emily, being young and naive, accepted this as something natural, as if their relationship was blessed by the church itself. Her trust in the priest grew, and with each meeting she felt more and more dependent on his attention and approval. Father Johnson was a master at manipulating the situation. He told Emily that he understood her better than anyone else. He told her that she was special, different from everyone else. These were simple but powerful words for a girl who was looking for understanding and support in a world where she often felt alone and lost. The priest became more than just a spiritual mentor, but someone who she felt truly cared about her spiritual well-being. Their meetings became more frequent. Father Johnson would invite her to stay after evening services to talk privately. These meetings took place in his study at the church, where there was silence and privacy. He always left the door closed so that no one would suspect anything was wrong, but each time their conversations became more and more frank. Emily shared her inner fears and doubts with him. She talked about the difficulties in her relationship with her parents, about the misunderstanding from her peers, about how difficult it was for her to find her place in the world. Father Johnson listened to her attentively, pretending to be completely immersed in her experiences. He increasingly convinced her that he was the one who could help her find the answers to all her questions, and her emotional vulnerability became the key to his control over her. The priest seemed to know how to push the right buttons. He often spoke of the world as a place of temptation and danger, and that it was through him that she could escape sin and find the true path. His talk of faith and salvation was intertwined with personal hints that their connection was unique and that she was the chosen one. Father Johnson told her that her faith and devotion to God made her special in his eyes. These words filled Emily with a sense of importance and significance that she had been missing in her everyday life. Over time, their meetings became more than just conversations. Father Johnson began touching her hand, hugging her, saying that it was simply a gesture of comfort and support. At first, Emily did not see anything suspicious in this. She thought that it was an expression of care from a man she trusted completely. But gradually, his touches became more and more intrusive, and it became difficult for her to ignore this physical contact. Emily, however, was confused. She didn't know what to feel. On the one hand, she was tormented by her conscience. She knew that something was wrong in this relationship, but she couldn't pinpoint what exactly. On the other hand, she was immersed in a sense of dependence on the priest. His words and actions made her psychologically vulnerable, and she felt that she couldn't cope with life's difficulties without him. Meanwhile, to the rest of his parishioners and townspeople, Father Johnson continued to be the same respected and devoted minister. No one could have guessed that something dark was hiding behind his respectable mask. People came to him for spiritual support, and he continued to play the role of the ideal pastor, caring and wise. However, no matter how masterfully he concealed his true nature, some things still began to arouse suspicion. Several parishioners began to notice that Emily was spending too much time with Father Johnson. She was increasingly staying after services, her behavior became withdrawn, and her interactions with friends and family diminished. Her mother tried several times to talk to her daughter about what was happening, but Emily, immersed in fear and dependence on the priest, avoided the conversation. Father Johnson told her that no one would understand their relationship and that they should keep it a secret. With each passing day, their relationship became more and more painful for Emily. She was caught up in conflicting emotions: love, dependence, fear, and shame. Father Johnson kept telling her that it was okay, that she should trust him, and that their relationship was something sacred, not to be discussed with other people. Emily didn't realize that she was trapped in manipulation and control, and that her life was slowly falling apart. The turning point was approaching. Emily increasingly felt stuck. She didn't know how to get out of this situation, but she felt that something had to change. She began to avoid meetings with the priest. Her internal conflict was growing, but she could not yet find a way to end this relationship. Father Johnson, seeing her attempts to distance herself, began to put even more pressure on her, which would soon lead to tragedy. Emily, as she became increasingly immersed in her own personal struggles and inner conflicts, continued to rely on Father Johnson as the only person she felt could understand her. These meetings became her only escape from the cycle of anxieties she could not share with friends or family. But with each passing day, her connection with the priest crossed the line into what could be called spiritual guidance. Father Johnson, with his keen insight into human psychology, used this knowledge to exert more control over Emily. He gradually began to instill in her the idea that their communication must remain secret. He said that no one would understand their special connection, and that others might judge her for opening her soul to him. These words became an alarm signal for Emily, but she could not understand her feelings. On the one hand, she felt an internal protest, but on the other, her dependence on the priest only grew stronger. Their meetings began to happen more often and in private. Father Johnson convinced Emily that this was necessary for her spiritual growth, so that she could understand herself. The girl believed his words, perceiving him as an authority capable of showing her the right path. However, she began to notice that these meetings were changing. Father Johnson's behavior increasingly showed signs that he was crossing the boundaries of spiritual communication. The physical contact that Emily had initially felt was a natural expression of care, became increasingly intrusive. He began to touch her hands, to hug her longer than was necessary for simple comfort. Emily felt discomfort, but she did not dare to say so, afraid of offending the priest. She believed that he was doing this out of care and an attempt to help her cope with internal problems, but she was increasingly immersed in a state of confusion. Father Johnson began to use another method of control: emotional pressure. He began to tell Emily that without him, she would not be able to cope with life's difficulties. He hinted that her spiritual growth was possible only under the condition of their close communication. These words, supported by the status of a priest, penetrated deeply into her consciousness, and the girl began to doubt her own strength more and more. Every time Emily tried to distance herself from him, the priest found a way to bring her back under his influence. He emphasized that she needed him, that no one else could understand her the way he did. Emily, being psychologically vulnerable, plunged into this cycle of dependency and fear, not realizing that she was at the complete mercy of a man who exploited her weaknesses. Meanwhile, her behavior began to change noticeably to those around her. Her mother and teachers noticed that Emily had become withdrawn and tense. She no longer communicated with her friends, did not talk about her life, and often withdrew into herself. Her mother tried to talk to her daughter several times, but Emily avoided these conversations, afraid that the truth about her meetings with Father Johnson would become known. The priest instilled in her a fear of exposure, and this fear kept her from any attempts to tell about what was really happening. Emily felt more and more depressed with each passing day. She knew that her relationship with the priest had become wrong, but she saw no way out. Father Johnson continued to insist that everything that was happening between them was part of her spiritual journey, but these words no longer brought her comfort. She began to notice that his influence over her was becoming an overwhelming force that was destroying her inner peace. Emily often thought about ending her relationship with Father Johnson, but she didn't know how. She was overcome with fear that the priest might reveal their relationship to others, and with shame for allowing herself to be drawn into this addiction. Father Johnson, in turn, realized that she was beginning to doubt the health of their relationship, and he began to increase the pressure on her, threatening her with possible consequences if she tried to break their relationship. This internal struggle gradually destroyed Emily. She was trapped in a cycle she could not escape from. Her dependence on the priest became more and more intense, and despite all her attempts to understand that her life was turning into a nightmare, she could not find the strength to break the cycle. Emily's emotional and psychological burden reached its limit. She could no longer hide from herself the truth that her relationship with Father Johnson had become unbearable for her. Her inner conflict grew stronger every day, and the girl realized that she had to break this relationship, no matter how difficult it was. She did not know who to turn to for help, since the priest had convinced her that no one would understand or support her. But Emily made a firm decision. She could no longer remain in this destructive relationship. Meanwhile, Father Johnson, noticing her withdrawal, increased his pressure. He felt that he was losing control over Emily, and this frightened him. The priest had grown accustomed to her being completely subservient to his will, and her attempts to distance herself threatened to destroy the entire system of manipulation he had built around her. He could not allow his power over Emily to be lost, so he decided to meet with her one last time. They arranged to meet that evening in an empty church office. Emily arrived feeling scared and confused, but certain that she had to end the affair. When she entered the office, Father Johnson looked tense and depressed. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Emily immediately sensed that something was wrong. The priest was trying to manipulate her emotions again, telling her that their relationship was important, that she couldn't just walk away. However, this time Emily was not going to give in to his words. She firmly declared that it was over, and she did not intend to continue this relationship any longer. Father Johnson's face changed dramatically upon hearing her words. Anger played in his eyes, and he lost his composure. He could not believe that his power over her had come to an end. The fear of exposure, mixed with the feeling of losing control, drove him to desperate measures. A furious argument broke out between them. Father Johnson tried to persuade her to stay, but Emily stood her ground. She was no longer afraid of his threats. She knew that her life was ruined, but continuing this relationship seemed even more frightening to her. When Emily tried to leave the office, the priest suddenly attacked her. In a fit of rage and despair, he grabbed her by the arms, shouting that she had no right to leave. Emily tried to break free, but Father Johnson did not let her go. Everything happened very quickly at that moment. Father Johnson, losing control of his actions, hit her in the face, and then grabbed the nearest heavy object, which turned out to be a candlestick, and hit her hard on the head. Emily collapsed to the floor. In the silence of the office, only her heavy, ragged breaths could be heard. Blood began to trickle across the floor, filling the silence with the eerie sound of drops falling onto the stone surface. Father Johnson froze for a moment, realizing what he had just done. Thoughts raced through his mind that it was all over: his life, his career, his future. He had killed the girl he had controlled and relied on to hide his dark desires. He knew there was no turning back. In a panic, he tried to clean up the crime. He wiped the fingerprints off the candlestick, closed the doors, and checked to see if he had left any evidence that could point to him. However, Emily's body lying on the floor was no longer concealable. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, it would eventually be revealed. Father Johnson was still in shock for a long time after he left the office. He realized that he had done something irreparable. There was only one thought in his head: he had to run. But before that, he had to make it look like Emily was missing. Several days had passed since Emily had not returned home. Her disappearance became the main topic of discussion in the small town. At first, the girl's parents thought that she had simply stayed late with her friends or decided to be alone to sort out her thoughts, since Emily had recently become more withdrawn and detached. However, the next day, when she did not show up at home or at school, the anxiety began to grow. Emily's mother, overcome with fear, called all of her daughter's friends, but no one knew where she was. The police were notified of her disappearance 48 hours later. When it became clear that this was no ordinary stop, an official investigation was launched. Patrol officers began combing the area, talking to residents, checking places where Emily might be. The girl's parents asked the local church to pray for her return. Father Johnson, maintaining a cool calm, led this prayer. He appealed to the parishioners with a call to support Emily's family, expressing sincere concern for her, skillfully hiding his crime under the guise of a holy man. Several days passed, but there was still no trace of Emily. The town was gripped by anxiety and panic. Every resident tried to help in the search, and the police interrogated relatives and friends. Suspicion began to fall on everyone who was somehow connected with the girl, but no one could imagine that the one who was behind this disappearance was the one everyone knew and respected: Father Johnson. Soon, one of the locals, walking his dog near the church, came across a strange find. Under the bushes, away from the main building, he noticed something that he initially took for trash. But when he came closer, the man realized that it was pieces of clothing. The strange arrangement of the things aroused his suspicions, and he called the police. When the patrol arrived, they began to carefully examine the area and soon came across a gruesome discovery. Behind the church building, under a thin layer of earth and dry leaves, lay Emily's body. Her face was barely recognizable due to the beatings, and traces of blood indicated the brutality with which she was killed. Her arms were spread out to the sides, and her clothes were torn. The picture was horrific. The police immediately cordoned off the crime scene, and news of the gruesome discovery quickly spread throughout the town. Shock gripped everyone who knew Emily and her family. People could not believe that something so terrible could happen in their quiet, peaceful town. Residents gathered at the church, discussed the terrible discovery, and wondered who could commit such a cruel act. Emily's mother, having learned about what happened, could not hold back her tears and literally collapsed from grief when the police told her about her daughter's death. The police immediately launched a full-fledged murder investigation. Detectives worked day and night to gather as much evidence as possible. The location where the body was found was near a church, which added even more questions. The fact that the body was hidden so close to one of the main locations in the city raised suspicions. But at this stage, the investigation could not pin any specific charges on anyone. Fear began to spread among the locals. No one felt safe knowing that the killer might still be among them. People suspected everyone around them, but not even in their darkest thoughts could anyone imagine that the culprit of this atrocity was a priest. Father Johnson continued to conduct services, although his face now showed more tension than usual. He felt the circle tightening around him, but he skillfully hid his anxiety, continuing to act like an ordinary pastor caring for his parishioners. The police began interviewing everyone who had been close to Emily in her final days. Among those questioned was Father Johnson, who played his part well, saying that he had last seen her at a church service. He said that Emily had always been a diligent churchgoer and had never shown any signs that anything was wrong. His voice was confident and his face was calm, although inside he was panicking. Police were unable to find any hard evidence that could link the priest to the murder, but some investigators began to ask questions about why the body was found so close to the church. A more thorough search of the church grounds began, and investigators soon came across another strange detail. Faint traces of blood were found on the floor of one of the church's offices, which at first glance might have gone unnoticed. This discovery became an important clue that could be the key to solving this brutal crime. Father Johnson, sensing that the police might be on his trail, became increasingly nervous. He knew that his lie might be exposed, and that the evidence against him was becoming more and more obvious. But he couldn't just disappear or run away. That would only arouse even more suspicion. Emily's body was found, and the town was plunged into terror. The police stepped up their efforts to find the killer. Every corner of the town became the focus of investigators, and the streets were filled with fear and mistrust. People discussed the incident, fearing that the killer might be among them. No one knew who to trust, and everyone seemed like a potential suspect. The police began questioning everyone who knew Emily. They questioned her friends, teachers, neighbors, and even her family. However, most of them were unaware of the girl's personal problems, and no one could have imagined that a priest so respected and revered could have had anything to do with it. However, among the first to be questioned was Father Johnson. The priest remained calm during the interrogation. His confident answers did not arouse the investigators' suspicions, but as a seasoned manipulator, he knew that his actions had to be impeccable. He described Emily as a kind, quiet girl who had always been devoted to church life. Father Johnson said that they were close as spiritual mentor and parishioner, but he never saw anything unusual in her behavior. During the conversation, the priest mentioned that he had last seen Emily during an evening service a few days earlier. He carefully crafted every detail of his story, trying not to give investigators any reason to suspect anything further. He also expressed his condolences to Emily's parents and offered to organize a memorial service, thereby reinforcing the image of a priest who genuinely cares about his flock. While Father Johnson tried to appear calm, the investigators continued their investigation. They were particularly drawn to traces of blood found in one of the church's offices. Although the stains were faint, they were a strong clue that could point to the crime scene. It was obvious that something terrible had happened in the church building. The police decided to conduct a more thorough examination of the office. They called in forensic experts and took blood samples for analysis. They also checked the entire office for other evidence: signs of a struggle, hair, fingerprints. Investigators knew that any little detail could play a decisive role in solving the crime. Meanwhile, they began to study Emily's behavior and surroundings. Her parents said that their daughter had been withdrawn, avoiding communication, and seemed depressed in recent months. Friends also noticed that she had almost stopped going out with them for walks and rarely shared her experiences. No one knew what this was connected with, but for the police, it became a signal that Emily could be hiding something serious. One of the teachers who spoke to police mentioned that Emily often stayed late at church after services, and that she had been seen in the company of Father Johnson in his office. This was the first clue that investigators could follow. Despite the priest's apparent innocence, they began to look more closely at his actions. At this stage of the investigation, the first suspicions began to appear that the priest could have been somehow involved in this case. But there was no direct evidence against him yet. The police decided to continue questioning his entourage, trying to find at least some confirmation of the strange connection between Father Johnson and Emily. Meanwhile, the priest became increasingly nervous. He felt that the police were getting closer to the solution, and he knew that his plans were beginning to crumble. He tried to maintain control over the situation, But the inner fear grew with each passing day. His every action, every word could now become the key to his exposure. Investigators began checking surveillance footage from cameras around the church and the city streets, hoping to find any traces of Emily's movements on the day she disappeared. However, most of the cameras did not capture anything suspicious. However, they were not going to give up and continued to look for any details that could reveal the true killer. In the days after Emily's body was discovered, the investigation began to take on a darker tone. As police continued to examine her final days in detail, the picture became clearer. Emily, investigators discovered, had been living a secret life in recent months, distancing herself from her family and friends. This led investigators to wonder if there might be something going on in her life that no one knew about. Emily's parents, in deep grief, tried to remember anything that could help in the investigation. Her mother thought more and more about the strange changes in her daughter's behavior, but could not offer any specifics. However, one fact attracted the attention of investigators. The mother mentioned that Emily often spent a lot of time in church, and even said that Father Johnson was more than just a spiritual mentor for her. This statement made the police wary, and they decided to check the priest more thoroughly. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread throughout the town. Residents who had previously not considered the possibility that something sinister might be happening to Emily were now beginning to ask questions. Some said they had seen Emily with Father Johnson in casual conversation, while others recalled how she often lingered after services, long after others had gone home. Suspicions previously hidden behind respect for the priest began to surface. At the same time, the police began receiving the results of the blood found in the church office. It turned out that the blood matched Emily's DNA, which immediately made Father Johnson's office a crime scene. However, the priest continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the murder. During questioning, he assured investigators that he did not know how the blood could have ended up in his office. He claimed that Emily may have injured herself while in his office, but this explanation seemed strange. Investigators were hesitant to jump to conclusions. They knew that Father Johnson was an important figure in the community, and his arrest without sufficient evidence could lead to public outrage. But the evidence that was beginning to pile up against him was becoming increasingly alarming. The next twist came when police received an anonymous letter. The letter claimed that the writer knew Emily was having a secret affair with Father Johnson. The letter was anonymous, and the handwriting made it impossible to immediately identify the sender, but its contents were a turning point in the investigation. Investigators began to wonder, was there really an affair between Emily and the priest that no one knew about? The police decided to deepen their investigation and began interviewing more people who might have noticed something. One parishioner recalled seeing Emily and Father Johnson in the church office through a cracked door. He described the encounter as too close for normal conversation, but thought little of it at the time. It became an important piece of evidence because it matched what the police already knew about Emily and the priest meeting frequently. Investigators began to realize that behind the facade of the priest everyone knew and respected, there was a dark and sinister side. His psychological control over Emily became apparent as they began to examine her behavior in the months leading up to her death. Her withdrawal, her depression, her strange changes in her life. All of this pointed to a deep internal struggle she was going through under the influence of Father Johnson. Meanwhile, the priest himself began to feel the police closing in. He remained calm in public, continuing to conduct services, comforting parishioners, and offering words of encouragement to Emily's parents. But inside, the tension was growing. He knew that the investigation could at any moment take an unexpected turn that would lead to his collapse. Every day became a test for him. He did not know when he might be arrested or when new evidence would emerge. Meanwhile, the police began looking for more evidence of a connection between Emily and the priest. They checked her phone, messages, and emails, but at first glance, they found nothing suspicious. However, they soon came across deleted messages that had been sent to a number listed simply as J. After much analysis, they were able to determine that this number belonged to Father Johnson. The messages sent to Emily were short and discreet, but their content indicated more than just spiritual guidance. This became an important clue that further strengthened the police's suspicions. As investigators continued to gather evidence, Residents of the town began to notice that the atmosphere around Father Johnson had changed. People who had previously admired his piety now began to look warily as he walked by. Some even stopped attending services, sensing that something was wrong. The police had not yet made an official statement, but rumors about his possible involvement in Emily's murder began to spread throughout the town. At that moment, Father Johnson knew his time was running out. He tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but his inner fear grew with each passing day. The pressure on Father Johnson grew with each passing day. The police continued to delve into the details of Emily and the priest's life, and with each new fact they uncovered, suspicions grew stronger. Despite his efforts to maintain a veneer of calm and control, his confidence began to crumble as rumors began to circulate. As investigators analyzed deleted messages from Emily's phone, they came across another important piece of evidence. One of the investigators noticed the timestamps on the messages. They matched the dates and times Emily should have been at home or at school, but the messages showed she was meeting with Johnson's father. Police began to piece together the chain of events, and it became clear that there had been frequent secret meetings between the two. This led investigators to pore over the priest's phone records. After receiving court permission to access his calls and texts, they discovered something even more disturbing. Hundreds of calls and texts sent to Emily over the last months of her life. It left no doubt their connection was much deeper than it appeared. At the same time, the police decided to conduct a more detailed examination of the church, and especially the study where traces of blood were found. They reanalyzed the evidence, and this time forensic scientists found several hairs that were identical to Emily's. This fact further strengthened the theory that violence had occurred in the study, and that this place could have been the scene of her last tragic meeting with Father Johnson. Father Johnson, seeing the police getting closer to uncovering the truth, began to make mistakes. One day during a service, he seemed so nervous and agitated that even the parishioners began to notice that something was wrong with him. His sermons became rambling, and his usual confidence gave way to tension. At one point, when a parishioner asked about Emily's fate, Father Johnson hesitated. His face tightened, and his answer was unconvincing. It was the first public sign that the priest was losing his composure. Meanwhile, investigators continued to piece together the chain of events. One of the key elements that caught the police's attention was the fact that Father Johnson began acting strangely immediately after Emily's disappearance. Several parishioners recalled that the priest had canceled or rescheduled appointments on the days she disappeared, and one of his aides even mentioned that the priest had asked that no one disturb him on those days. This added another link to the chain of evidence pointing to his possible involvement in the crime. Soon, the police received the results of a test on a candlestick found in the study that Father Johnson had tried to thoroughly clean. Traces of Emily's DNA were still on the surface. This was a crucial moment in the investigation. The police now had enough evidence to bring charges against the priest. In addition, police began receiving responses from residents of the town who began recalling strange moments in Father Johnson's behavior. Someone mentioned seeing him in Emily's company outside of church, and one parishioner recalled that the priest often locked himself in his office immediately after services, spending more time there than usual. All of this information began to fit together into a larger picture, in which Father Johnson's role in Emily's death became increasingly clear. Father Johnson tried to maintain control of the situation, but deep down, he knew that his lie was about to be exposed. In recent weeks, his anxiety had only increased, and it had begun to affect his behavior. He became more irritable, often left the house without explanation, and even his family began to notice that something was wrong with him. However, even knowing that the police were gathering evidence against him, the priest still hoped that he would escape punishment. He was preparing himself for the possibility that he would have to defend himself in court, but his confidence that he would not be arrested began to wane. He realized that time was against him, and each day brought more evidence of his guilt. Meanwhile, the townspeople began to become increasingly wary of the priest. Many of them, previously devoted to his service, now felt anxious and suspicious. Rumors circulated that the police were close to uncovering the truth, which only increased the tension in the community. People began to avoid him, fearing that a criminal was hiding behind his saintly mask. But Father Johnson himself did not yet know that the police had already prepared a warrant for his arrest. Rumors of Father Johnson's possible involvement in Emily's death spread throughout the town. People who had recently admired his ministry now discussed his strange behavior and rumors of secret meetings with the girl. However, no one had any concrete evidence, and the priest was still respected in some circles. Nevertheless, amid growing anxiety and tension, the police were slowly but surely getting closer to solving the case. Investigators had gathered enough evidence to formally charge Father Johnson. Emily's DNA, found in his office and on a candlestick that was now clearly used in the attack, became crucial evidence. Analysis of phone records also revealed frequent and secret contacts between the priest and Emily, increasing investigators' confidence in his guilt. Under pressure from the evidence and growing public interest, the police decided to arrest Father Johnson. A warrant was obtained early in the morning, and a group of detectives, along with several patrolmen, went to his home. They knew that arresting such an influential figure as a priest could cause a negative reaction from some residents, so everything was carefully planned to avoid a public scandal. That day, the priest was going to hold another service, as usual. Father Johnson, although he looked tense, was preparing his sermon. He knew that suspicions were growing, but he continued to hope that he would be able to avoid exposure. However, the inner fear did not leave him, and each morning he woke up with the feeling that his life was falling apart. When the detectives arrived at his home, Father Johnson tried to maintain his composure when he saw them at the door, but his confidence was shattered when they presented him with an arrest warrant. The priest's face went white, and he froze for a moment, realizing that this was the end. He tried to speak in his defense, but the words caught in his throat. He could neither protest nor defend himself. Too much evidence was against him. "Father Johnson, you are under arrest for the murder of Emily Sanders," one of the detectives said as he cuffed his wrists. The priest did not resist. He could only stare silently at his life in ruins. He was escorted out the back door of the house to avoid prying eyes, but word of his arrest spread throughout the city almost immediately. When he was brought to the police station, the interrogation began. Father Johnson still hoped that he could justify himself. He repeated that he had nothing to do with Emily's death, that she was just a parishioner, and that their meetings were purely spiritual. But the investigators no longer believed him. All the evidence, from DNA to phone records to parishioner testimonies, indicated that he was lying. The more he talked, the more obvious his despair and fear became. While the interrogation was going on, the townspeople began to discuss the priest's arrest. People who had previously respected and trusted him now felt betrayed. They could not believe that the man to whom they trusted their innermost thoughts and confessed their sins was involved in such a terrible crime. The church, which had always been the center of the community, found itself at the center of the loudest scandal in the town's history. Meanwhile, the police were increasing the pressure on the priest, hoping for a confession. But Father Johnson, despite the overwhelming evidence, stubbornly denied his guilt. He tried to portray himself as the victim of a misunderstanding, claiming that someone was trying to frame him. But the investigators knew the truth was coming. They knew his resistance was just an attempt to delay the inevitable. The priest's arrest caused a wave of public outrage. Many residents, having learned the details of the investigation, could not believe that such a respected man was involved in such a terrible crime. Rumors spread with incredible speed, and everyone in town discussed what had happened. Some parishioners who had previously defended Father Johnson now began to doubt his innocence. Others, on the contrary, tried to find an explanation for his actions, claiming that it was some kind of mistake. The police began preparing the case for trial. They knew the public was waiting for the truth, and the evidence they had gathered was enough to bring formal charges. Father Johnson was isolated from the rest of the prison population to avoid attacks from those who had already heard of his arrest. His career, his reputation, his life, all of it was destroyed overnight. The town was plunged into a dark atmosphere. People who had previously considered their community quiet and safe now feared that monsters like Father Johnson might be lurking in their midst. Following Father Johnson's arrest, the city fell into an oppressive silence. People who had previously looked up to him as a moral paragon and spiritual guide could not believe that there was a dark side behind the facade of religious piety. Rumors of his involvement in Emily's murder continued to circulate throughout the city, fueling mistrust of the church and its leaders. For many parishioners, the situation came as a shock. Not only had they lost their spiritual guide, but they had also lost trust in the very system that was supposed to protect their moral fiber. Meanwhile, Father Johnson continued to be questioned at the police station. The priest, under pressure and aware that his situation was worsening every day, maintained his previous behavior. He refused to admit his guilt and insisted that he was simply a spiritual mentor for Emily. His attempts to justify his frequent meetings with the girl seemed increasingly unconvincing to the investigators, who had already collected enough evidence to bring charges against him. Police detectives continued to systematically gather evidence to bring the case to trial. Investigators knew that every action they took would be under intense scrutiny from both the city and the public. They could not afford to make mistakes. They needed to gather irrefutable evidence that would stand up to trial. A team of experts reanalyzed all the evidence they had found, from blood and DNA to cell phone messages. Meanwhile, the city was plunged into an atmosphere of anticipation. Many residents began to avoid talking about what had happened, preferring not to discuss such a painful topic. However, in kitchens, shops, and on the streets, people quietly whispered about the possible outcome of the case. People tried to understand how such a respected man could be capable of such a monstrous crime. As the time approached the trial, prosecutors began preparing their indictment. They knew that the priest's trial would be a high-profile case, and the public was waiting for justice. They prepared carefully, knowing that Father Johnson's defense would likely be based on an attempt to justify his actions as supposedly spiritual care for the girl. However, the evidence already spoke for itself. On the day the case went to trial, a crowd of journalists and residents gathered at the city courthouse to hear more about the charges. Police and prosecutors held a brief press conference to confirm that the priest was charged with the premeditated murder of Emily Sanders. The announcement sparked a wave of discussion and outrage in the city. Although many had already suspected his involvement, the official indictment shocked everyone. The prosecutor gave reporters the lowdown on the case, saying that the evidence included Emily's DNA found in Father Johnson's office, phone records, and text messages that confirmed their secret meetings. The evidence was irrefutable evidence that the priest and the girl had a deeper connection than he had let on. The public was in shock. People who had previously defended the priest now began to reconsider their attitude toward him. It was especially hard on the parishioners of the church, who for many years had looked to Father Johnson as an example of piety and morality. Many began to ask themselves, how could they not have noticed this before? How could the man to whom they trusted their souls commit such a terrible crime? Over the next few weeks, Father Johnson's case was the talk of the town. Newspapers and news outlets published stories about the town's struggle to recover from the tragedy. Journalists uncovered more details about Emily's relationship with the priest, based on materials provided by the prosecutor's office. These stories only added to the tension in the town, where people felt betrayed and had lost their moral compass. Meanwhile, Father Johnson's lawyers were preparing his defense. They were trying to build a line that all of his meetings with the priest were purely spiritual, and that Emily's death was a tragic misunderstanding. The lawyers argued that the police had no direct evidence that the priest had intentionally killed the girl. However, the evidence gathered by the investigation clearly pointed to his guilt. The police and prosecutors were confident that they would achieve justice. Father Johnson, despite the accusations, remained calm in public. He continued to maintain his innocence, claiming that he had always acted in the best interests of his parishioners, and that his relationship with Emily had been within the pale. Behind closed doors, however, his confidence was fading. He knew the case was heading toward an inevitable conclusion, and that his lies would soon be exposed in court. The trial was drawing ever closer, and the atmosphere in the city grew tense with each passing day. Residents who had previously been divided in their opinions about the priest's innocence were now increasingly inclined to think that he was guilty. Father Johnson's trial became the talk of the town and beyond. Reporters from regional and national publications flocked to cover what promised to be one of the biggest cases in the small town's history. For many residents, it was a moment of truth, a moment when the truth would finally come to light. The courtroom was packed. Among those present were Emily's friends and family, parishioners who had previously revered the priest, and ordinary citizens shocked by what had happened. People had gathered not only to hear evidence of Father Johnson's guilt, but also to understand how a man they trusted could become a criminal. Father Johnson looked composed but tense as he was led into the courtroom. His face was calm, but many could see that it was only a superficial composure. Behind it was fear and anxiety. He knew the evidence against him was strong, but he still hoped his lawyers would convince the court of his innocence. The prosecutor began his opening statement by stressing that this was not just a case of murdering a young girl, but also a betrayal of trust by a man who was supposed to protect his flock. He noted that Father Johnson used his position to manipulate Emily and ultimately kill her when she tried to sever their bond. The prosecution presented key pieces of evidence to the court: Emily's DNA found at the crime scene, phone records, text messages indicating frequent secret meetings between the priest and the girl, and witnesses who saw them together. It all came together to form a picture that indicated that Father Johnson had not only the motive, but also the opportunity to commit the crime. Among the evidence presented, special attention was paid to the candlestick on which traces of Emily's blood were found. The prosecutor emphasized that it was this object that most likely dealt the fatal blow. Forensic experts confirmed that the injuries sustained by the girl were consistent with blows from such a heavy object. This was one of the key pieces of evidence linking the priest to the murder scene. The defense attorney took the floor next. He began by attempting to refute the charges, arguing that the priest's encounters with Emily were purely spiritual, and that the evidence that was discovered was an accident, or the result of manipulation by the real killer, who was allegedly trying to frame Father Johnson. The defense argued that the prosecution had no direct evidence that the priest had inflicted the fatal blows. They tried to build a defense that the murder could have been committed by someone else, and that the priest was a victim of circumstance. But the more the defense attorney spoke, the less convincing his arguments seemed. The evidence collected by the investigation was too weighty to be simply ignored. The prosecutors confidently built their line of accusation, focusing on the facts and evidence that pointed to the guilt of the priest. The next day of the trial was devoted to testimony. Emily's parents, clearly shaken, testified about how their daughter had gradually become distant from the family in the months before her death. They said she often stayed after church services, spending time with Father Johnson, but never shared the details of these encounters with them. One of Emily's friends also testified. He said that Emily had once mentioned feeling strange after talking to Father Johnson, but did not elaborate. The witness claimed that Emily had been depressed lately and was clearly hiding something, but no one knew what it was. The detective leading the investigation gave the court a timeline of events. He described how police found traces of blood in the priest's study, how forensics confirmed Emily's DNA, and how the candlestick used in the attack was found in the same study. The detective also mentioned how Father Johnson had given contradictory statements several times during interviews, which only increased suspicions. With each new testimony, the situation for Father Johnson became more and more hopeless. His lawyers tried to cast doubt on the evidence, but the evidence was too strong. The connection between Emily and the priest was undeniable, as was his presence at the crime scene on the day of her death. One of the key moments came when the analysis of phone messages was presented. The prosecutor read the contents of messages Emily sent to Father Johnson's number. In these messages, the girl spoke of her fears and her desire to stop seeing him. These messages indicated that Emily was trying to distance herself from the priest, but he continued to press her. The trial continued, but it was already obvious to many that the truth would soon be revealed. The trial against Father Johnson continued, and with each passing day, the situation for the priest became darker. The prosecution presented more evidence that implicated him in Emily's death. Each day, new facts were revealed in court, and Father Johnson's reliable reputation was finally destroyed. This time, the hearing featured a crucial piece of evidence that shocked everyone in the courtroom. The prosecutor called a mobile data expert to the stand, who presented detailed records of calls and messages between Emily and the priest in the months leading up to her death. These records showed that their relationship was far deeper and more intense than Father Johnson had let on. The expert explained how the deleted messages on Emily's phone were restored. In one of them, Emily wrote to the priest that she could no longer continue these meetings and felt confused and depressed. This message became important evidence that the girl was trying to end the relationship and the priest was putting pressure on her. The prosecutor focused on this fact, arguing that it was Emily's desire to get out from under the control of Father Johnson that became the trigger for the tragedy. But the case did not end there. The next witness, a psychology expert, confirmed that Emily's behavior in the last months of her life showed many signs of suppression and psychological manipulation. The expert analyzed her messages, as well as the testimony of witnesses, and came to the conclusion that the priest, with his power and influence, skillfully manipulated the girl, exploiting her vulnerability. This testimony was devastating for the defense, because it confirmed the version that Emily was not just a parishioner, but a victim of long-term emotional and psychological abuse. The following day, the court heard evidence from the detective who had examined the crime scene. He described in detail how Emily's body had been found, and what evidence indicated that the crime had taken place in the priest's study. Particular attention was paid to the discovery of the murder weapon, a candlestick that bore traces of blood and fingerprints. The prosecutor asked the forensic scientist to confirm that the fingerprints on the weapon matched Father Johnson's, which he did with complete confidence. This evidence was one of the strongest in the case, directly linking the priest to the murder. Defense attorneys tried to dispute the fingerprints, arguing that Father Johnson, as a priest, would have touched the item in the course of his daily duties. But the prosecutor quickly rejected these arguments, recalling the traces of blood that were found on the candlestick. Each new piece of evidence further strengthened the prosecution's case. The priest's lawyers became less and less convincing, their defense weakening with each passing day. The defense tried to switch to the theory that Emily and Father Johnson had no romantic connection, but phone messages and numerous testimonies proved otherwise. One of the prosecution's key witnesses, who had known Emily for a long time, took the stand. It was a friend of hers who recalled the last days before her death. He described how Emily had shared her worries and fears with him, but never revealed details about what had happened between her and the priest. The witness said Emily seemed depressed and often spoke of pressure from an important man without naming him. This testimony further confirmed that Emily had been trying to get out of a difficult relationship, but had found no way to do so. The next piece of evidence was a blow to the defense. The prosecutor called an employee who worked at the church, who testified that he had seen Father Johnson lock the doors to his office after services when Emily stayed there longer than others. The witness said that this had become increasingly common before her death. This testimony allowed the court to see how the priest was gradually locking Emily into a prison of psychological addiction. By this point in the courtroom, it was obvious that the prosecution had built a strong and logical case. The defense had little to say in response to such powerful evidence. The priest's lawyers attempted to refute the testimony of the witnesses, but their arguments were weak and unconvincing. Everything pointed to the fact that Father Johnson would not be able to escape a just verdict. The city residents who came to the court to observe the trial had already begun to discuss the inevitable outcome. Many of them, who had previously doubted the priest's guilt, were now shocked by the evidence that was revealed during the trial. One of the parishioners, a longtime defender of the priest, even admitted to journalists, after one of the trial days, that she no longer believed in his innocence. With each new day, the process came closer to its conclusion. The trial against Father Johnson, which had seemed to last forever, was drawing to a close. It had been a painful time for the townspeople, as they faced the harsh reality that their esteemed priest might be a violent criminal. For days, the prosecution had presented one damning piece of evidence after another, and now that all the cards had been laid bare, the final point seemed inevitable. Father Johnson remained outwardly composed as he sat in the dock. But each day spent in the courtroom increased his inner tension. He knew that the evidence against him was too strong, and his defense had failed to convince the court or the public. His lawyers had exhausted their arguments, and even they were beginning to realize that there was little hope left for an acquittal. The day had arrived for the defendant to make his final statement. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Would Father Johnson, the man the town had trusted for years, finally confess to his crimes, or would he maintain his innocence to the end? The tension in the courtroom was running high. When the priest was called upon to speak, His face was pale, his voice hoarse and strained. Father Johnson stood before the court and the audience, pausing for what seemed an eternity. He began to speak slowly, trying to maintain the appearance of calm, but it was obvious that a terrible struggle was being played out within him. He began his statement by repeating the usual phrases about his long service and how he always tried to help people. But his voice was shaking, and despite his attempts to sound confident, his words sounded unconvincing. Those present in the courtroom listened to him with caution, expecting something more than just another acquittal. Finally, after a long silence, Father Johnson made a surprising confession. His voice, which had been reserved from the start, became quieter, almost a whisper, as he said, "I lost control. I made mistakes." The words hung in the air, shocking everyone present. Even though everyone suspected him of the crime, a direct confession from Father Johnson was something no one expected. He began to explain how the connection with Emily, which had begun as spiritual guidance, had gradually turned into something much darker and more destructive. The priest acknowledged that his power over the girl was not only spiritual, but also psychological. He explained how she had gradually become dependent on his attention and how he had begun to lose control of his actions, becoming caught up in his own manipulations. "I didn't want it to end this way," he continued, aware that with each word, he was delving deeper into his confession. "But when she decided to leave, I couldn't just let her go." These words became the turning point for the court. The priest finally admitted that it was his jealousy and fear of losing control over Emily that caused the tragedy. He said that on that fateful day they met in his office, and Emily again told him that she wanted to stop seeing him. Father Johnson, overcome by emotion, could not control himself. In a moment of rage, he grabbed a candlestick and struck her, not even realizing that he was killing her. There was a deathly silence in the courtroom. Everyone present was shocked by this confession. Many could not believe that a man who was a spiritual leader for them was capable of such a cruel crime. The prosecutor, holding back his emotions, made his closing argument, stressing that the confession only confirmed the conclusions they had reached during the investigation. He stressed that Father Johnson had abused his position, manipulated and controlled Emily, which ultimately led to her death. The defense, realizing that it had nothing else to say in response, made a short statement that the priest repents of what he did and is ready to accept the punishment that the court will impose. When the court retired to consider its verdict, the town already knew how it would end. Father Johnson had put an end to the story himself by admitting his guilt. For several hours, the judge prepared to announce the verdict, and the people waited anxiously to see what would happen next. At the end of the day, the judge returned to the courtroom and announced the verdict. Father Johnson had been found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. His face was expressionless as the judge read the verdict, but his eyes, once bright and confident, were now staring into space. The city, shocked and devastated, finally learned the truth. The city was plunged into an oppressive silence and disappointment after the verdict was announced. Journalists, locals, and Emily's friends stood around the court, where one of the most high-profile trials in decades had just ended. None of them could fully comprehend that this had actually happened, that their esteemed priest had been found guilty of murder, and that the mysterious connection to Emily had been so dark and devastating. Local and national news outlets covered the trial with particular attention. Articles and television spots told the story of the fall of a man considered a pillar of spiritual life in a small town. The reputation of the church Father Johnson led was destroyed, and the faith of many was shaken forever. For parishioners, the verdict was a real blow. Many could not cope with the fact that their mentor, to whom they trusted their deepest secrets, turned out to be a criminal. The church, which had been the center of the city's spiritual life for many years, was deserted. People stopped coming to services, and the building that had once been filled with the sounds of prayer now stood in silence. Some parishioners began to look for other religious communities, while others stopped attending the church altogether, losing trust in an institution that they believed was supposed to protect moral principles and guide people to the path of righteousness. Emily's family tried to cope with the tragedy, but their grief was beyond words. Her parents, who had struggled to understand what had happened to their daughter from the start, now knew the truth, but it brought them no relief. The loss was too great. Emily's mother recalled how her daughter had changed in recent months, how she had become withdrawn and depressed, but she never thought it would end this way. After the trial, journalists took note of the townspeople's reactions. Many gave interviews expressing their disappointment and distrust of the priest, who, as it turned out, had been manipulating Emily for a long time. One parishioner who had defended Father Johnson for many years admitted that she could never trust religious leaders again. She said that this situation had become a turning point in her life, and now she felt betrayed. The townspeople, once proud of their spiritual leader, now felt ashamed and disappointed. They talked among themselves about how such a thing could happen in their quiet, prosperous community. Many wondered, how could they not have noticed that behind the facade of a virtuous priest lurked a man capable of such violence? Some parishioners, despite the guilty verdict, still tried to justify Father Johnson. They said no one could understand what was going on inside him, and that he may have been a victim of circumstance. But most people in town no longer believed in his innocence. The story of his manipulation and murder became a symbol of how even the most respected and trusted men could abuse their power. The church closed indefinitely. The diocese, realizing that the priest and the entire parish had been completely destroyed, sent a representative to sort out the situation. For months, the church building stood empty, symbolizing the collapse of not only one man, but the destruction of the faith he symbolized. Meanwhile, Father Johnson was sent to prison to serve a life sentence. It was a complete downfall for him. A man who had once been respected and revered was now convicted of one of the most heinous crimes. In prison, the priest was isolated from other prisoners, fearing retaliation or attack. His days were spent alone, with no hope of forgiveness or redemption. But even in prison, Father Johnson could not fully admit his mistakes. Despite his public confession in court, he continued to justify his actions, claiming that it was a tragic mistake and that he did not mean to kill Emily. But his words no longer mattered. The city had turned its back on him, his reputation was in ruins, and he would now spend the rest of his days wondering how his life, once full of respect and trust, had come to such a tragic end. The town, once known for its quiet and peaceful atmosphere, was now darkened by the shadow of this terrible crime. People debated for a long time how such a tragedy could happen in their community, and everyone in their own way tried to come to terms with the event. But one thing was clear. This story left an indelible mark on the souls of all who lived through it. Several months had passed since the end of the trial, but the events surrounding Emily's murder remained deeply etched in the hearts of everyone who lived in the small town. Residents continued to try to return to their normal lives, but something had irreversibly changed. The town no longer seemed the cozy, safe place it had once been considered. The story of Emily's tragic death and Father Johnson's fall had become part of the local lore, passed down through conversations and memories. The church, once a center of spiritual life, remained closed. No one knew when or if it would reopen its doors to parishioners. Some residents proposed demolishing the building, seeing it as a symbol of broken trust and betrayal. Others hoped that one day the church would function again, but under a new, trusted priest who could restore the people's faith. But for now, the place remained empty and silent, a mute witness to the tragedy that had occurred. The town, despite its attempts to move on, could not fully recover from the shock. For many residents, Emily's story became a grim reminder that evil can lurk behind even the most virtuous guises. People became more cautious in trusting authority and began to value their own intuition and judgment more. Emily's family never recovered from the loss. Her mother, overcome with grief, spent her days alone and silent, trying to find meaning in what had happened to her daughter. Emily's father tried to support the family, but he was also broken. The loss of their daughter left a dark shadow on their lives forever. Although justice was served and the killer was punished, it did not bring Emily back to them. The city's youth, having learned of the tragedy, grew up with the story as a warning. Many teenagers now thought more about their surroundings and the people they trusted. Schools and public places began to talk more about the need to protect young people from the influence of those who might use their position and power to manipulate. Despite the people's desire to forget the nightmare, the story of the murderous priest and his victim continued to surface. Local newspapers returned to the topic from time to time, reporting on Father Johnson's life in prison. He continued to live in isolation, having escaped physical violence but never finding peace. Occasionally, the town heard rumors of his attempts to write letters asking for forgiveness, but none of these letters received a response. For Father Johnson himself, the prison walls became not only a physical confinement, but also a symbol of his own prison, built of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. He was left alone, cut off from the world that had once honored and respected him. Now his name was cursed, and the memory of his actions remained only within the confines of this high-profile crime. Over time, symbols of Emily's memory began to appear around the city. A small memorial stone was erected at the spot where she was found, carved with words of love and remembrance for the young girl whose life was so cruelly cut short. Every year, on the day of her death, people would bring flowers and candles to the site, remembering her and hoping that something like this would never happen again. The town continued to live. People returned to their daily routines. But every time they passed a church or a memorial stone, they felt that this tragedy had changed their lives forever. The story of a priest who manipulated a young girl to her death remained as a reminder that even the most seemingly safe and trusted places can hide dark secrets. Years passed. New generations replaced the old ones. But the memory of that terrible tragedy lived in people's hearts. It became a warning that evil can hide behind any mask, and that one must be careful in one's trusting relationships. People learned to listen more to themselves and their loved ones, trying to prevent such horror in the future. The story of Emily and Father Johnson remains in the minds of the townspeople as a dark chapter in their history. The tragedy changed the town forever, but it also taught them a lesson that helped them become stronger and more attentive to those in need.